Upstream refers usually to exploration, development, and production of oil and gas resources. Some of the key terms which is very useful to be familiar with, we talk about, I heard some very exception here from Norway, from water, that applies also to oil and gas in US and Canada. For most part of the world, doesn't matter if you're in Africa, South America, Central America, Asia, Europe, the government is the owner of these resources. That's why we talk so often about the host government. And because we see in a minute here, the costs are very expensive, risks are very high. Usually the government want to do this by themselves. So you need to allow someone else to do that for you. So you require legal instruments, law, contract, regulations. That's why it's refer a lot to host government contract, host government instruments. There are some of these which are very familiar, especially in Africa and Central Asia. It's called production share agreement. It's not very common in Europe, apart from Cyprus. They have typically other type of contract. I've just seen a minute. Typically, who do the business here is the oil and gas company. Not necessarily, but quite often you have a national company. National company could be 100% owned, or could be predominantly, like for example, in this country here, there are two. There is Equinor, like Petrobras, which is a state company, which has stock exchange. Anybody can go and acquire some of their shares. And you have Petoro, which the we have in Brazil, PPSA, which is 100% owned, which has specific economic interest from the state. And then, of course, that we'll talk about E&P, which is because here exploration production. This is very important in terms of how you go forward, health and safety environment. And of course, in the course here we'll have also OMG as well. The focus of this presentation, because time is very short, we'll focus on the upstream part. So I'm not talking so much about transportation, refinery, distribution, and your gas station. So this is just here. Actually, this was my dear friend, actually, who could put this slide here, because there are different types of actually activities from oil and gas. It can be from onshore to shallow water to deep water, and even if we heard some of the presentations before here about UNCLOS, and that's an interesting slide just to represent that. Because when you think about historically, when they started doing gas business, from oil and gas we know today, because they know oil for a long time, for centuries of years. But as we understand today, it was started from mostly from 1800s in US, and it then evolved from other parts of the world, and it has signed terrible contracts for the government. Imagine the whole Persian kingdom had a contract. The whole Nigeria, back in the days, and many other countries signed terrible concessions, which was good for the investor, terrible for the government. And then as the UN evolved as well, so the countries got more sovereign rights, they create national companies, and they realized that actually they need to have more power. But the point of talking to you related to that is that back in the days, even when they started to do activities, it was either onshore or very shallow, extremely shallow. So that's why the convention at the time they created in the 50s, was basically offshore. So they put that you need to remove all the facilities. And as this evolved, and that could be an issue for you to think about fresh groundwater, is what happened to this infrastructure at the end of the work. That's a problem. Because when the UK started to do this in the 70s, Norway in the 70s and the 80s, who think what's going to happen 30, 40, 50 years from today? Who's really thinking about it? They want to do like the business, put the infrastructure, pump oil, move on, next stage. But then at some point, these facilities will get old. And they will need to do, back in the days, unfortunately, the name we used to call abandonment. What it means abandonment? Just leave there, unfortunately. Of course, this was onshore. As you move to offshore, not doable, because you cannot just dump this like that. There is safety navigation, clear of actually facilities. So then actually they realize that there is issues about liabilities, issues about financial guarantees, issues about approval procedures. So that's just one example as how things evolved. And there is regulation that now it has to be every free floating sometimes, which will be much more easier to move this facility to a different location as well. And there's also, I just finished a book actually a few years ago about this, and actually about sustainable practice. United Kingdom, actually, they have some horrible history about that, which actually was a case of O'Brien's farm. And it's probably, if you ask me, the most successful Greenpeace case was this one. Because most of the cases, they're not being so successful. Because in this case here, Greenpeace says, how come Shell made a lot of money, long time, and the end of the life of this can dump this in the ocean? It was not exactly like this, the facility, but something like that. And of course, the general public say, if I cannot take this piece of paper and throw in this floor right now, how come they can dump thousands of tons of infrastructure in the middle of the ocean? That's very wrong. And everybody could do that. And they say, I agree, because I cannot dump this in the ocean. One piece of paper, how come they can do that? So actually, they did not consider this was the most sustainable practice. Believe me a lot, because what they would do, they would cut this and then remove these parts to be recycled, and other parts would be sink into an artificial reef. This is very successful in Louisiana, in Texas, in California, many other parts is very successful. But from a principle perspective, Greenpeace said, oh, that is wrong. I don't want to hear what you want to say. This is wrong. And then actually, they put so much pressure. This was approved by several different departments there in UK, from the environmental, from the business, from stakeholders, all of them approved. But Greenpeace says no. And because there was so much pressure back in the 90s, then actually Shell was losing because people were stopped buying their tank on the Shell. The Shell, after a lot of debate, say, you know what, okay, I will remove all that. And Greenpeace, what they claim about the pollution, they came later say, okay, I over-exaggerated several times. But my point was there from the beginning. So ultimately, this was successful because Great Shell changed this, but they forgot to tell you that a lot of the money who paid this was the British government. They don't talk about that. Because usually who paid this is the government, because the government gives you tax benefits, or it depends on country cost recovery. So a lot of this comes from the British taxpayer. So that's another discussion. They don't discuss more about that. But at the end of the day, that's what happened. But ultimately, it's different when Greenpeace goes and says, stop oil and gas. So that means to you that I cannot have this. I cannot have this phone. I cannot travel by plane. I cannot have asphalt. But that's related to oil and gas. So people don't want to change their life to that level. But to this, so that's why ultimately one question you need to think from this discussion today, what are you going to do with these facilities? In your case, from my understanding, it's not so complex because it's not going to go too far and you're going to go that deep. We still might need to think about decommissioning this at some point, which was the lessons from the oil and gas business. And this was some discussion we discussed. You need to think from a legal perspective if you want to regulate this offshore groundwater. Is this, generally speaking, I don't think oil, gas, and mining will change from an offshore perspective almost anywhere in the world. The owner is the government. Private, you might exist domestically onshore, but offshore, unlikely to find anywhere in the world. You can say that you own the water, oil, and gas in the middle of the ocean. Unlikely. So you have to deal with the government. Then the key question you need to think about how you organize your structure. Back in the days, including this very country, did not have an oil and gas ministry. They did not. They actually had a business administration. And as they evolved, they realized that actually they created a ministry, as people know most part of the world. Either it's called Ministry of Oil, Petroleum, Natural Resources, Energy and Oil, energy, whatever combination of name you can think, they typically is the one. Countries that's strongly dominated by oil, they tend to refer Ministry of Oil. Countries that has huge business in energy, like Brazil, call Ministry of Energy. Mines and energy. So it depends where you are. You might have different authorities. They may separate between oil and gas and mining. They put the same ministry or not. Some countries, it's important to highlight, you might need the Ministry of Finance involved as well. So not all of them, but sometimes you have the Ministry of Finance. Sometimes you have, which is very unusual. For example, in Paraguay, you have that. Azerbaijan, you have that. Chad, you have that. The parliament is involved. Your contract is not legally binding until the parliament approves your contract. You have an idea what that means? That means that if you want to change anything in your country, even to sell part of this business to someone else, the parliament has to approve. That good or bad, that's another discussion, but certainly very bureaucratic. And typically, the minister would deal more the ministry with more policy issues. not day-to-day business. Typically, you have a directorate, National Petroleum Agency or agency dealing with these resources, even from oil and gas and mining, etc. You know, the question we have this debate here, is that is it more suitable to leave this authority to the water agency or water authority? Is it the oil and gas? Either way, you need to have some collaboration because the people from the water probably unlikely know the details of oil and gas and drilling and seismic, and people from oil and gas unlikely know the details about water resources. So you need to have some collaboration. Who will handle in the end of the day is up to see each country. But I certainly believe you need to have some collaboration either way. And most likely you have, as I mentioned, you, national companies and the private entities involved as well. And then I think I'm not going into too much details. And of course, please direct me along the way if you have any question. But unitization, in US, it's quite a unique system they have there. Goes back to why they have this unitization. They used to call something, actually, a basic principle called rule of capture. What that entails is that whatever is mine, and can use it the way I wish to do. And if you have the same mentality as probably I have, you will do the same. So what would you do? Let's say we have a border here. I go to the border of my land because I want to protect my area, and I will drill as fast as much as I can next to you. What do we do? The same. You go to the border and you drill as fast as much you can. So if everybody does that, what's the consequence? And I think from that perspective, the water is not going to be that different from oil and gas. You damage the reservoir because you produce it without the best technique, without coordination, and it's messy, and you have the same, I believe, problem with water. So what you do collaboration. In most part of the world, the government control the resources. So the government don't want the kids to fight. They want them to collaborate because they're part of the responsibility. They want the best well-being for the kids. But in some parts of the world, they don't have parents. Each kid do whatever they wish to do. And that's the problematic. So that's why unitization in many parts of the world, it is on the law. It's on the hydrocarbon code. Because the ministry will say like this: if we identify that our oil and gas, same like water, they don't respect boundaries. They don't care about boundaries. This was the reason Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. They claimed that Kuwait was really the oil that belongs to Iraq. So that's what, of course, this was like the context, but not the reality. But the point is that legally, usually, the government has the power to avoid you to do that because they want to collaborate efficiently. This gets more messy when you go internationally. Because domestically, the minister can say, you stop, and I'm sure you have to stop. But does he have power across the fence? It depends who you are. Now, for example, I know some colleagues here in Malta, not too far from Malta. If you go to Cyprus, Cyprus is one of those very unique places in the world that in the European Union, there is a fence crossing in Nicosia, the capital there. There is another part there which actually is self-declared an independent country, which most part of the world does not recognize. Turkey is one of them they recognize. And in that case, you have Cyprus has already discovered gas, so has Israel, and there is a potential in some area which is bordered with the disputed territory that actually Turkey sometimes sends ships, say, stop doing this, otherwise you face consequences. China has done the same. The most disputed area in the world from a shipping maritime perspective is the South China Sea. China said this territory is mine, and then Malaysia say this is mine, and then other one says mine. So there is a lot of dispute between Philippines and many other countries who owns what. In that case, it's harder to enforce because it depends on not a sovereign country, which might not be part of UNCLOS, or maybe it's part of UNCLOS, and maybe don't care about enforcing other UNCLOS. But the rationale here is that this agreement is to collaborate with better efficiency and to avoid waste of resources. We actually need to ask about this. Are you obliged to do that? Or common sense require you to do that? That's the question I have for water resources. Does the law impose you to do that? Or you, in a common sense, would agree to do that? So that's one of the things, because there's a lot of discussion about that and we have other topics, but we can come back to that in a minute. Again, Corporate law 011. You know what company wants? To make money, profit. That's why it's a corporation. It's not a foundation. It's not an institution. It's not charity. You know. But what profit means to A doesn't mean that means to B. Same thing when Harvard was discussing here. That was the cheapest room I have with lawyers. Depends, you know, because of the day that there is a large law firm, you know, I might charge you like maybe $1,500 an hour. There'll be other firms who might be charging you $250, $300 an hour. Why they charge differently? Size of the company, office they have, reputation they have. Companies are the same. Some of them be able to work with a lower OPEX. And that's initially very interesting in this part of the world. North Sea is getting mature, which means less new findings, increased costs that might not be doable for some large companies. So what they will do is that they leave for the new entrants, which is called junior independents, not necessarily, but usually smaller companies. They can operate for lower costs, more efficient. What the challenge you have there? They might have less money. They may not necessarily, but most likely might have less technology or knowledge or experience. So you have to be careful when you do this trade-off. From a government perspective, it's nice because you postpone the life of the field, make more profits, you make more taxes, you gain more profits, you keep more jobs running. But if things go wrong, who's going to pay for that? You know, so you need to be careful about those things as well. Certainly, I think oil and gas is different than water resources because, from that perspective, because oil is such an international commodity globally. So, depending on the contract, you can book this from accounting perspective, your discoveries as part of the balance sheet. You know, issue I have here because a lot of international business, how to send this money back home? Is there actually a capital gains? There is export taxes, other taxes you want to before. And that's the funny thing people don't talk about oil and gas. Most disputes in oil and gas quite often happen out of success, not failures. Can you imagine that? You know why? I can tell you why. Because when you think from a governmental perspective, what you're looking for right now, Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe now is looking for oil and gas. Barbados is looking for that. They haven't that. Not really. So what they would do? Attract investors. What can I offer? Oh, tax-free, without investment treaties, disputes, arbitration internationally. They entice the investors, whatever they can offer. And the investor take the risks. They need to think about the payback, which might take 5, 10, 15 years if they find something, if it's commercial, if they can develop that. And along the way, after 10 years of investment, taking the risks, they find something. This is exactly what happened in Guyana. Guyana 2016. Guyana went down there. Oh, ExxonMobil. Wait a moment. This is unfair. You found billions of dollars with this contract. We split 50-50, 1% taxes. But you discussed this 10 years ago? No, discussed this 10 years ago. You know that. But of course, Exxon, I take out my hat for them. They're sharp. They're smart. Instead of saying no, they say, let's negotiate. What they managed to do? They told to the press, we increase 100% of the royalties. And people, wow, double. Wow. But they forgot to tell you that increased from 1 to 2. And the average is 10. Just forgot that detail. But anyhow, you know, so they were smart. They went ahead to solve a problem. And what they did, they extended the contract because they're supposed to return some areas. So very sharp negotiators. But the point is that stability is very important. And there are clauses in the oil and gas contracts called freezing clause, economic equilibrium clause, that will avoid countries sometimes to change the rules of the game, or if they change, they pay compensation for that. Of course, that this might be important for all water as well, avoiding double taxation, because if you're doing business internationally, you don't want to pay tax twice. This year, I think, might be less challenging, the safety and the environment, because I think the business you might be doing here might be less complex, but it's important to understand the risks. Of course, companies care about CSR, so if you come with an innovative solution that you can bring the water to the community, plus what they're doing is a win-win. No, it's just a question, a matter of that. You need additional infrastructure to bring this water to this community, or you can already use what you have, how much to do that, to see the feasibility of doing that. The government, they want to think about today, tomorrow, in the next 5 years, the next 30 years, you know? So that's why It's very important for the government when you think about that, something called local content. And I'm pretty sure this is important in mining, and I'm very sure it will be important for water as well. Because you talk about here, projects in Africa, projects in South America, projects there. The basic rule about local content is to hire local people, hire local goods, local services. We need to think about the reality versus ambition. And that's the problem sometimes about climate change. That's the problem about corrupt. That's the problem about local content. Because where you wish to be doesn't mean where you are today. So you need to have realistic targets and meaningful progress to get where you want to go. Otherwise, this might lead to corruption. And then this is something that, of course, is interesting related to water because of the oil and gas, you have actually issue about pressure. As pressure reduced, you're not able to extract as much as wish. That's why Norway has amazing secondary recovery, tertiary recovery, that you keep pumping as much oil from places that you cannot. And one interesting way to do that is with CO2. So actually, one of the best ways to keep pumping oil is to capture the CO2. That's called CCU. It's carbon capture utilization. I published a book last month about that. And that's something very cool. And of course, you might encounter when you produce oil and gas, just oil and gas and water, oil and gas, oil and petrol, etc. So that's why this could be interesting, this correlation with the water synergy with oil and gas as well. When you think about, I know there are some one or two geologists, which I think is better for you not to raise your hand. But if you think from oil and gas perspective, where do you think is the most significant risk for oil and gas company in the beginning of the project? What? Exactly, because if you don't have a geology, it doesn't matter if you live in Narnia. You can say that no tax, do whatever you wish, doesn't matter because if you have the commodity, nothing else matters. But then you might be in a situation like Venezuela, which has more oil than Saudi Arabia, more oil in the entire continent, but still doesn't matter so much because issues of sanctions, issue of corruption. So all of these come to play, but you start from there. Because if you don't have geology, the same thing here. What's the point to offer amazing business opportunities to French groundwater, but you don't have it? It's great. You might have all the legal framework, all the right incentives. So you need the commodity first, the natural resources. Then you need to have technology together. Because back in the days, people could not drill oil and gas over 8 kilometers. Now they can. An issue about the environment. There are some places which is off the limits. For example, in Australia, the coral reefs off the limits. Some places here in Norway is off the limits. And then sometimes these limits change. Sometimes they do not change. And also finance, So just to have an idea, typically an offshore well is $100 to $150 million. One well. It is a lot of money. And if you don't put an infrastructure, floating LNG, for example, I was involved in a project in Mozambique, $12 billion, just a facility. Can you imagine? $12 billion just to have this facility to actually capture the natural gas at the sea, convert it at very cold temperature into liquid, and then you export this, then someone else take this and make it heat and convert into natural gas. So it can be very expensive business. I mean, political issues can be very challenging here because sometimes you think that the most stable countries are developing world. No, there are many rules in oil and gas in the US which don't even know what applies because US has a lot of executive orders. And there's Trump said one thing and then Biden says something else and Trump does something else. So sometimes the places you think are very stable or not. So the reality that in this business, politics is very complex. Natural resources deals with sovereignty, deals with a lot of money. So countries are aware, companies as well. Security, I work in Sudan and other places which might be very challenging. Sometimes we need to think about how to get there. That's might be an issue with some of the areas they're showing the map, they're seeing you. And some of the areas may be challenging from piracy, terrorism, and other issues. Social, we had a class just an hour before here, so you just listen to that part as well. And the legal part, sometimes simple, sometimes not, because you need to follow in terms of approvals from the ministry, from the parliament, which can take some time as well. And this is unique about the oil and gas industry. It's unique because it's an industry that's first, the chance of success usually less than 20%. Start off. Secondly, you might see the color of the money after 10, 15 years. What business do you want to do like that? You might spend hundreds of millions of dollars. The chance you lose is very high, and you might see money in the next 10, 15 years. Who wants to do that? Don't forget about that as well, the risk they take and the amount. And this is why this industry is so unique that competitors are friends. They collaborate. They sign agreements to share risks and share rewards. Because the commerciality might take a long time, and you need to think about the payment and the commissioning towards the end. Which here is very useful for you to apply the analogy here. Is typically throughout the world, rules, contracts vary where you are. If you are onshore, shallow water or deep ultra deep water tend to change. Not necessarily everything. In UK, you have different type of license, depends where you are. In Pakistan, you have different countries where you are. In Brazil, you have different countries where you are. So it's important to know this because depending on the location where you are, country might be different. What's the rationale is that as more risk offshore, the government is to help more. Typically, you might pay a little bit less tax, maybe you have a bit more time, because the rationale is that if it's going, imagine you are back in the US, you know, go to the Wild West. Of course, you have great prices to go there because you don't know what's up there. It's very risky, very adventurous. You know, even my fellow Portuguese 500 years ago, when I went to take this boat, travel through the world, are they looking for a great reward? Whatever risk is involved. So as more risks, more rewards. And that's something important to know here, which this has a lot of impact actually in not actually offshore, but certainly has a lot of impact on onshore, unconventional resources. Because oil and gas comes from a rock source, and the rock source has porosity. Sometimes the porosity is very tight, so you need to fracture this rock, and that's called, we have to do hydraulic fracturing. In order to do hydraulic fracturing, you typically use a lot of water, and it's not salty water. It has to be potable water. For example, this is one of the reasons, not the only reason, why China in Australia did not took off their shale. Because a lot of the places where they have scarcity of water. So you use the water for agriculture, you need for energy, but you need for drinking purpose. I believe drinking will come first. You know, so ultimately you have to find some challenge sometimes of priority between using these different sources. From a legal perspective, you know, if I want to do business in a different country, you know, the first place where I start to see is internationally. Because I've been in the situation there I was in a given place in Africa, you know, where this country was offering me to do business at the company I used to work before. However, some other parts of the world does not recognize that as part of his country. It belongs to someone else. So and then to whom do you sign? Who has authority to sign a contract with you? Is it this country? Is it the other country? And how about NGOs who send you a letter that you sign in and dispute the territory? Do you really want to do business there? So it's important to see there is boundaries, disputes between the countries. Are you aware of the risks you get into? Are you comfortable? You want to go there? Probably you don't want to. Then what you want to check, but usually don't have much details, constitution. Iran is one of the few countries, Mexico used to be no longer, used to have restriction in the constitution and type of the contract you can have. Most part of the world doesn't go that level. They just talk about oil belongs to the government and the government regulate that. Cuba is one of the few exceptions that you don't have the detail like hydrocarbon law, but most part of the world you do have a code, a law, regulate oil and gas resources, and you mostly like have some instruments that you have in one. In a nutshell, you have basically this type of contract. And the most important one, historically, is the first. As you have in US, you have in UK, you have in France, you have in Canada, you have Australia, you have New Zealand, you have exceptionally in Africa, you have in South Africa, and you have in Morocco. What does, and in Brazil, you have that as well. What is that contract? Either the concession, license, lease. The investor take the risk. If you find oil, good for you. If you not find, you lost the money. Zero risk. Well, what did the government get for that? Taxes and royalties. The government don't get part of the oil, they don't get the profit. They get actually taxation. This was evolved mostly in Indonesia in the 60s because they say, we want to have more control of these resources, and they create something called production share agreement or production share contracts. What is the concept behind that? We split the production. We don't want investors to take all of that. And that's the essence, which predominantly in Africa, I would say 2, 3 countries don't have, all the rest has. There are some exceptions like Angola. They have concessions from the 50s that Chevron has back in the days, even before actually they were independent in 75. But the majority there is this. Then you have the kind of like a service contracts. The service contract you can have mostly the pure service contract and the risk service contract. Petrobras used to use the 70s, the risk service contracts. What is that entails? Like the PSC. Who take the risk? The investor. If you don't find something, that's very akin to the license. The main difference from the license is that number one, here you have a cost recovery, and that usually leads to a lot of corruption. Why? Because in this type of contract, all the costs incurred by the investor following the contract procedures, called accounting procedures, will be reimbursed. So the cost incurred will be reimbursed like the strip. You provide the receipt for the cost incurred, they'll pay you the money back if you follow the certain rules. Imagine this, what you're doing here, in the scale of millions and millions and millions of dollars, dozens and hundreds of contracts and multiple contracts. Who is going to audit all of that? That you're really doing what you're supposed to do. That you're not really, or actually you do like the airport, you just do the basic metal detector and you randomly stop people, or you're going to stop every single person, strip them out to see the details, go to the next flight. You're going to do that? So that's the challenge you need to think about the system you might have there. The pure service contracts, mostly like you pay the company to do the work and you take the risks. The difference, most likely, I have a book about that, many articles, which is interesting. Which one is the best? There's a lot of debate. African people, for example, believe PSC is the best. Middle Easterns, they prefer quite often service contracts. Western countries, everyone apart from Cyprus, prefer concession in license. Which one is the best? As most lawyers will tell you, it depends. Because on the terms and conditions, everything in life can be good or bad. Depends where you go. If I tell you have to travel to this place, and I ask you where, how, can be great, or might be not great. So it's important to know the terms and conditions. And certainly, you need to understand the risks tends to be with investors, the ownership of the production, because you don't own what's below the ground. Who control the operations? The government usually has a lot of to say because they're resources, but the government doesn't have the money. So you have to find a balance there. Reserves depends on the contract. Politics affect, because sometimes I would say the governments are not very transparent and more lenient to the investors, or they were socialist, or they were this or this, that. So there's always room for renegotiation, expropriation, and debate. That's how we have.
The session or meet.
It's just this slide that can be like an hour, but
You don't have that.
okay.
Sure.
30 minutes?
No, no, I won't speak. I think we have more slides like.
No, we have more slides. We just want to say about time.
You have 3
Really?
minutes, 40.
Okay, good.
Okay, finish everything or we,
Finish your joint, this presentation.
or presentation only, no discussion.
There will be discussions afterwards, but.
Okay, so this
Let's
is,
wrap it up maybe in 30 minutes.
okay, this slide is, if you want to understand oil and gas industry contracts between investment and government, if you just understand this slide, you're good to go. Just one slide. Just one slide. This is the essence of any oil and gas contract between the investor and the government. Doesn't matter where you are in the world. If you know just this, you're ready to sit in a negotiation table. Just this slide. Because it starts by this one. Believe me, I've been in a almost dispute because of that. And that's important for water as well. When you sign a contract, you need to say where is the area to do the business, right? Very basic. Coordinate. Believe me or not, I was in this country that they get the wrong data. The government has their own data, company has their own data. We signed the deal and it was like a few $1 billion. And somebody called a few weeks later, we need to renegotiate. Are you joking? Renegotiate? What is it about? Oh, actually, a fraction of the block belongs to someone else. Imagine. Like you buy the house and realize the pool from the neighbor. And we talk about, fortunately for them, this country has so much oil, they can actually change a little bit and everything will be okay, you know? But it's important to know that. And the interesting thing, which you could apply this actually from a perspective for the water, because from the government perspective, you don't want the company to sit in, do nothing, and wait for the right time to do things. You tell them this, you know, you have X amount of time to do exploration. And if you don't find anything, I took it back and give to someone else. So the government want to maximize the area so the companies are more efficient as possible, because if they don't do the right work, and what the company don't want, to return profitable area. Because imagine here how this works. No? It does.
No, but not well. I can't see it from back.
No? I see. Try to make it. Okay, so you have an area like this. The contract will say this, like, in the first 4 years, you need to give back like a third of the area. But you don't know where's the best area. So you give the obligation of the company to find where it's gonna give back. Is it here? Is it here? Is it here? If you don't do the right work in this time, you might give your precious area. So that's called relinquishment. We pressure companies to give back what they don't invest. Terms and contract, you know, depends where you are, you know, at the end of the day, that's the duration of this contract from exploration, which probably might be different for your case here, you need to adapt, is from 5 to 15 years. That's the time you usually give to the company to try to find oil and gas in most part of the world. They've been divided in phases. 3 plus 3 plus 4, 4 plus 4, depends. Production tends to be minimum time, like Iranian contracts and Venezuelan contracts, very short. Long contracts, most part of the world, 20, 30, 40. US, whatever, as long as you produce. In some parts of the US, especially private. But offshore, you might have a limited as well. And then you have what the government wants. This is very important for water as well. You want to give a commitment to the company, what's called minimal work program. Because I'll sign you this contract to have this access to this area, but you need to promise to drill X amount of wells, to shoot the seismic, and you provide guarantees for that. Because if you just come with nonsense and don't do the work, I execute the collaterals. That's why usually there is not much dispute about failures. Because if you have the right mechanism, you just execute the guarantees. So generally speaking, you have less problem related to that. But there are some poor contracts, you might have some medium. You might have the same thing here. The water, because the company who might sign the deal with you, you might have to incorporate the company locally. Do you have the resources there locally? You might need the company guarantee from abroad. You need to approve what's the plan for the next year or the multiple year. This year, I don't think that might be an issue, but depends on the country, even for water, is this. All the water you produce is gonna belong to whom? To the country or to the company? Are you gonna share that? That's up to discussion. But the oil and gas, most part of the world, you know, is either the company keeps everything or part of it. It's not common to the government keeps everything. It's a very exception. Like in a few places that do that. Other important things to understand is who owns what. Who owns the pipeline? Who owns the drilling rig? Who owns the platform? Is it the company or is it government? Or do you need to transfer that to the government and at what costs? Who determines if what you find is commercial to extract? Is it a company or is it the government? What do you think?
Company.
Why is that?
Because it is the one who conducts the operation, the
Because they are the ones who know the costs.
Exactly. It's the same thing because in the day that is the one who's paying the bill. I'm going to pay the bill. I should say yes or no. Because I might say, no, thank you. Then you give back to the government and do whatever they wish. No. Is natural gas the same as oil or is it different than oil? Same thing, right? No? Yes? Maybe? Oil and gas the same? No, it's not. It's not the same. Very similar. Why different? Depends, you know, depends on what you're talking about. To extract, very same concept. To develop, very same concept. Price is different. And logistics is difficult. Remember here, when you have the ISIS, not here, in the Middle East, you know, most of their money, you know how they're getting? The ISIS was getting most of the money Oil fields. They're getting easy oil, pumping this oil, putting in a truck, selling to whatever. Did they sell gas? No, they did not sell gas. They don't have pipeline. They don't have an LNG facility. So gas usually is marginal complex. Mozambique has the largest reserves, actually potential of gas, still in the process to be developed. Why? Because it's just non-associated gas, meaning it's just gas. You produce or you don't produce. Unfortunately, most countries, what they do, shamefully, flaring gas is the cheapest because the best one, you sell it, but you need a market for that and infrastructure. Secondly, you reinject because you keep pumping oil and it's good for reservoir. Third cheapest, worst option, you just flare. If you go to Google Earth at night, you see cities where there's no city. What is it? Flaring natural gas. Terrible for the environment, make no money, pay no tax. Hard to believe, but believe me, some countries don't even know how much they're producing. How do they know? Well, the company tells them. Can you believe? Hard to believe, but unfortunately it happens. It's important in the government to have auditing system and we understand what we're producing and the value we discuss. This is very important for you to consider for water. Do you have already infrastructure in place? Maybe. Maybe there is an infrastructure for oil and gas. The question you need to ask, which is very well regulated in the UK, quite well regulated in UK, not well regulated in most part of the world. It's called third-party access. The worst case scenario that exists in the world about that, of course, between two different countries, when Sudan separated the north and the south, and the oil, unfortunately, can only go from the south to the north. And the north says, you can use my pipeline. But you know what? Pay $10. What? $10? Are you nuts? There's no way I'll pay it. And they say, okay, turn off. You're going to do. So that's the problem that happens in many countries. The companies, for corporate reasons, acquire infrastructure. They have excess facility to be used at some point. And now this regulation tells you need to give access to someone else. This is why in the UK, Norway, you can develop oil and gas for lower costs. You know, not as low as you go to Iran, to Saudi, Kuwait, because they can use existing infrastructure. They don't need to build a new one. So the question we need to have is that if somebody has a facility and you want to use this for water purpose, can you force somebody to give this access? Most of the countries, the answer is no, you cannot. There are a few places where you actually have a regulation that force them to give you a fair access, or they give an access for a ridiculous price. You know, that's an issue to consider. Of course, that you still need to typically to import goods and equipment. Generally speaking, you can freely export that. There is no domestic obligation to say you can only sell this locally. Typically, let's say you can export unless there is an emergency situation of wildfire or whatever. You need to keep this oil internally. I discussed about sending money back home before. Fiscal incentives. This is one of the worst things countries need to face. You know what used to be the cheapest price of gasoline in the world until not too far ago? Can you guess? Which country was the cheapest? That with $1, you could buy 3 million liters of gasoline. I mean, you're not joking. 3 million liters. Correct. They changed it. But Venezuela used to give for free. You just pay $0.00001 cent, which means that you pay just the guy to put it on your tank, just the tip. You don't pay the gasoline, pay the tip. Nowadays, no longer. But even if you go to many of these places, the price of gasoline is like 20, 30, 40 cents. How much is the price of gasoline here? In US dollar, how much is it? A liter. $2 a liter. It's pretty heavy. And they produce a lot. You know? And I can guarantee to you, if you go to most of the countries in many parts of the world, especially the poorest one, is much cheaper than that. Who's paying the bill? Somebody's paying the bill. There's no free lunch. No. So when you see a cheap price of gasoline, cheap price of electricity, somebody is paying that bill. So you have to consider about consequences of the subsidy. Sometimes required, sometimes challenging. Environmental protection. Does this country go into details? Certainly not. You need to have a law for that, policy for that. What you might find here is environmental impact assessment. Then yes, but not the detail level because probably is not the right place here. Decommissioning, discussed with you before. You need to plan this well ahead. What's the key main issue you want to consider? Money. Imagine you go to an amazing, huge party and people spend all the things they want to do. They go crazy, they break everything. And then the party, there is no money left to repair. So that's what you need to plan. Think about the future. Where is the money? How to protect about that as well. And stability, I discussed about that. This is very unusual. I'm sure water law will be very similar. Very unusual today to go to a country and you sign a foreign law here. Most well-known law used in the oil and gas industry internationally, England and Wales. It's been used even in bizarre. Some countries sign this, but it's not usual today. You go to Uganda, Uganda law, Nigeria, Nigerian law, Brazil, Brazil. This is today. It's very common to do that. Dispute resolution might be similar to water as well. Typically, not always, they do not want to go to local courts. Typically, they will go through arbitration. And of course, you need to discuss about, because there's a government involved, they don't want to have a commercial arbitration. They want to go to AAA, FCIA, ICC. So you might have an institutional or ad hoc arbitration involved. Communications, of course, here, for example, this was an interesting way the region has done to legally increase the local market. What they did, they put in some proposition of the countries, you need to speak Norwegian. Is that illegal? Certainly not. But smart. Because if you go to US, you go to Uganda, Nigeria, you speak the English, okay? Because Norway has this issue, they had to change their laws for all time, including actually Kazakhstan as well. Kazakhstan because they joined the WTO. And here because of EU, because there's anti-competition authority that will say that actually you cannot provide certain restrictions to certain nationalities. Discussions you guys have here very important. Historically, the data belong to the company. No longer. Anywhere in the world today, the data of seismic drilling, all of that belongs to the government. The government gives you the right for a certain period of time or exclusivity to use this data. And actually, they might put restrictions to take the data abroad because back in the day, they just took the data and disappeared. Confidentiality, for me, one more before here. Training, the only country I have done seriously training, but it's so hectic, was Morocco. Cooni, the national company there, they had a provision there that actually the employee want to study because they speak French and Arabic mostly. They used to go to IFP, Institut Français de Pétrole. And then there they will have to the French Institute of Petroleum. And then they send you the invoice for the person to the ticket. They send the invoice of the training and the invoice of hotel. Who wants this headache? Nobody wants that. What they want to prefer to go, give you the money. And you hope you train these people, So that's time sometimes you need to be careful if the training really goes to training and what you really do, Confidentiality. Today, vast majority of the countries, the country they sign is open access. You can go right now and you can Google, you'll find exactly the country they sign. Unfortunately, a few countries still do not publish this. And bizarre, some of these countries are part of what's called Transparency Initiative. Isn't this like a joke? Your main resources is your main company. You want to join initiative to be more transparent. And you don't even publish the base agreements that derive most of the money of your country. It's just amazing, But typically here, contract is not confidential. The term is not confidential. So it might be confidential, some of geological data for something that we discuss unitization. Typically, the contract will be very short to say if it's domestically, the government might force you. If you don't come to an agreement, they force you to get an agreement. If it's internationally, the ministry might have to be involved. This is very important from actually water as well, because one of the key things oil and gas companies, energy companies, IT companies, any company in the world makes money. What is that? Is M&A. Not M&M. M&A, mergers and acquisition. Buying and selling is where they make a lot of money, freely. So typically, you can sell your rights. But in order to sell your rights, you need to see is this, can you leave the party? Yes, but did you pay your bill before? That's the first question. Sometimes you need to pay something to sell. Yes, Emil.
Yes, just wanted to ask something regarding the transparency and confidentiality. Don't you think in some countries?
I have one slide later, more details, but yes.
No worries, carry on. I can
Yeah,
keep
no.
my question to the end of the
Yeah.
slides. That would be better.
And then how much time do you still have? Like 20,
50.
25? So this is actually one of the areas that I have written the most in my life about joint ventures, you know, and you have to think about here, there are two types of joint ventures. In the oil and gas industry, typically when you refer to a joint venture, a JOA, joint operating agreement, usually you're referring to the relationship. I have to go back here to facilitate. Because you have government and you have investor A, B, C. So the PSC concession license is this relationship, investor government. Joint venture is this horizontal relation, the relation between A, B, and C. Why did they sign this? For a very good reason called joint and several liability. What it means, in simple terms, is that to the government, it doesn't care if you have 5, 10, 20, 50, 60% of the project, doesn't matter. Towards the government, everybody's 100% liable. You can come after only this one here, and this one here will have to ask proportionally. So the joint venture, the key concept is called proportional liability. It's like your shareholders, you're responsible for your shares. You want to be responsible for 100%. That's the first reason you want to sign this agreement. The second reason, oil and gas is a complex work. They go from the Arctic to the desert, going to deep offshore to the jungle, which means that people might have different expertise. Someone might be much more likely to be more deep offshore. Someone might be more likely to be shallow. Someone might be more inclined to exploration. Someone be more inclined to production. So because of that, you might want to share skills. Why I have to hire all that? Why not team up with these other people? Or maybe you have the access to the infrastructure because you have another company who has a pipeline. Or you might have a huge market. You might be, for example, Korean companies, Japanese company, Impex, Kogas. What do? They have a small participating interest. Why? Because they want to secure production. So sometimes there are different interests, and there is also political will. If your partner, like for example in Venezuela, who is the key investor in Venezuela in Guyana today? You know which companies? ExxonMobil. Do you want to mess with those guys? Maybe not. Because maybe you're talking to the U.S. State Department there. So ultimately there's politics involved as well. So all of that comes to play when you talk about the joint venture. So Norway, it is unique in this scenario. Why? Because as I mentioned to you here, this is a private relationship. Imagine all of you here want to rent an apartment, and I'm the landlord. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I want to get the $1,000. If it's Hamad paying, Hanez paying, I don't care. $1,000, it's $1,000. As long as it's clean money. So the issue, what's the issue of this here in Norway is that the government was just gonna give you the contract of this relationship. As many parties want to say, well, hang on a second. So you want to regulate our relationship and this relationship? Why is that? So if you go to most parts of the world, there are very few exceptions, and Norway is the leading one. You need to use the government JOA model for. This is very new, extremely new. And of course, what I love about that, Norway very kindly used to have they changed the name, but not the business. Used something called Oil for Development. And to understand, I think it was good program, We're sharing the Norwegian values, Norwegian history, the Norwegian lessons for the developing world. So if you go to Mozambique, you will find this there. Yes, if Norway had advice on them, Mozambique, yes, Norway giving free advice for them. Funny enough, Ecuador was there as well, just curiosity. But the point I'm saying here is that usually this is not the case. Because if towards this agreement, everybody's liable. If in this agreement, anybody selling, you need to approve. Any disagreement, all the work you do, you need to approve. Why do you care if we agree in details otherwise? Explain to me. Tell me a good reason why I need to know. Usually there is no good reason for that.
We want to make sure the money is, as you said to me, is clean.
No, this is different. Because if you are concerned about the money not being clean, you cannot be part of this agreement. This agreement is you as an investor with the government. The only difference is this one. This is telling some details of this relationship, but all of us is involved. If any of us here is not respectable, doesn't have the money, or doesn't have knowledge, you should not be in this agreement. You should not be. So this is why most part of the world, this is private. And if you need to give something, like in Brazil, required to give something, they give you a 2-page document. They say, we are a joint venture, we're collaborating, we are following here what you need to know, who is the operator, who are the parties, these are our shares, and there is one paragraph. We might agree more specific details in a separate agreement. That's it.
As a government, I want to know, what if you disagree on some particulars? As a government, should I stay in limbo and allow you to be in your own world? If, for example, two of you disagree with one of you.
But a moment. Norway, not to this agreement.
Why not?
Just give them another form. It's not clear to it.
Question is like, as a government, I want to know, what if, for example, you at some point disagree? Where does that leave the government? Should the government allow that condition to just?
Yes, some PSCs, including provide exclusive operations. There is a possibility, even at this level here. Even at this level here, you might have provisions in the PSC mention what happens in those scenarios. But ultimately, to you, the government, doesn't matter because everybody's liable. The GOA, I have a book just about that. It's called Sole Risk, which is what you're inclined to mention. What does sole risk entails? Entails when there is a decision about the group, and maybe you did not vote for Trump, but he's your president, right? I'm not American, so I cannot tell that. But then what happened there? But the point is allow you, when you are in a group excursion, you say 3 of you want to go to the waterfall, and the remaining just want to go on the main road. This provision said the 3 want to go to the waterfall at your own risk. The bear eats you, got lost there, God forbid, it's your problem. Have nothing to do with that. That's the sole risk. But the sole risk is complex because you're breaking the consortium. And if this really go ahead, you need to inform the government to split this area into separate agreements because you're no longer joint several liable. So that's what I'm saying. Generally speaking, the government has way to protect itself in the PSC that he's comfortable with, And what I might agree, sometimes you might be concerned about that if you have a national oil company. And if a national company is not strong enough, and if the terms of this GOA might be detrimental to your national company if they don't know how to negotiate, then I might agree in some of the scenarios, you need to be more cautious. But otherwise, you're covered. But only a few countries like Qatar, they do differently. In Qatar, the joint venture is the host ground intermediate. That's unusual. Because in Qatar, you don't sign agreement with the ministry. You sign Qatar Energy. That's different. So there, the joint venture, it is the host ground intermediate. It's not the case in most parts of the industry. And also, you can have a joint venture in other levels, like in the service contract, 10 minutes. So you still can have a joint venture in the other levels, like in the service contracts, in all of these different agreements. So this can go along a long discussion as well. Some issues to bear in mind that some of this could be applicable for water as well. Number one, boundary, because you might have dispute between boundaries. The boundaries can be within the same country, because maybe there is a dispute between this province and these other provinces, can be with other countries. You need to understand here the difference between what is a local content and national content. Some countries, they make this distinction. Local might be in this province, national in this country, or sometimes anything in this country is both, depends where you are. You need to understand, do you need a national company to participate? Yes or no? The first question I ask when I see that, the first question, what is the first question you as an investor ask if you see there's an obligation to have a state participation? What would you want to
The
answer?
percentage,
Huh?
the percentage of.
Yes, along with, what's the other question related to that?
Do you mean like participation
The
interest?
money, if you.
Are you obliged to be my partner? How much? And do you pay? But if you have to be my partner and I have to pay for you, that's a different equation. It's a different cost. Because if I have to be a partner, but you pay your share, that's a different game. And if I have to be a partner and pay for you, but do I get the money back at some point or don't get ever the money back? You know, that's some things you need to consider. Some parts of the world, and for me, this is most unique. You find number one, Australia. And then number two, you find actually Canada, Norway to a certain extent, and other places very poorly. Indigenous rights. US still is not that great either. Because if you find about some place like Australia, they will not allow you to drill, to shoot seismic until you get clearance from indigenous rights. Have you seen that anywhere in the world? Most of the time they just move on, do the business, you know. But there, and in Canada, you can just Google there. Many projects, $1 billion, stopped because of they still discussing what means meaningful consultation. That's remarkable, you know, that you stop like a huge project like, from all perspectives. So that's something to consider. You have indigenous rights. Indigenous rights usually is not local communities. That's different. Talking here about people being there for hundreds and thousands of years as well. So you need to see how the law will treat different than all this. Even private rights, you know. So that's why typically when you talk about this, oil and gas companies love that. They don't like usually onshore. You know why? Because of the previous presentation. Because offshore, you're talking to the fish, which usually he's very obliged, you know. So it's easier to do this process. You know, you don't have complexities of different communities. When you go to Australia, then you have the tribe want this, the other one want that, the other one want this. And then there is people who want bribes along the way. There are people chatting about terrorism. There is all of this mess. You know, sometimes clean, sometimes it's very messy, sometimes very difficult. For offshore, you don't have to talk with local government, federal government, regional government. It's just federal government. So usually the process is more straightforward. However, it's more risky, it's more expensive, you know, the other side of the equation as well. And this is something important you see as well from a legal perspective. How do you acquire this right? Most part of the world who tend to avoid some questionable procedures goes for auction license routes. So you need to put, believe me or not, Norway is not the most transparent from that perspective. Can you believe? Brazil and Mexico is 2-3 times more transparent on how you acquire an oil and gas country than Norway. Do you know why? Because in Norway there is a system of trust, and they give a lot of powers to the ministry to decide what they wish to do. To the level here that the consortium who create is the government. They team up, say you are married together, good luck, and that's the way to go. Nowhere else in the world they do that. Norway. So that's why sometimes when people say, and when I use Norwegian practice in Africa, I put my hand on my head and say, oh my gosh. Nothing is the same. You mean like, but it's nothing from the language, from the nature, from the law, from the history, from the culture, from the access to resources, and they forget about something. Norway started in the 60s, 50s, learning. They all came here of the contract, say, sign this one Norwegian government, and they signed it. They didn't know much. They did not have Equinor, Statoil, you know, they were taking time. Norway, I love this. People love to create a sovereign wealth fund. Norway created a sovereign fund in 1996. Over 20 years of producing oil and gas. 20 years. And Norway was not that poor at that time. It was not rich, but certainly not that poor. And you go to a poor country, find oil and gas, sovereign wealth fund. Seriously? So how do you use? Now they're using the money for the sovereign wealth fund to pay daily costs and budget of people. So is it really sovereign wealth fund? Anyhow. So the point here is that you need to decide how to acquire this open negotiation or actually license bid procedures with clear rules on how to do that. Confidentiality, we're coming towards, I think this is like probably towards the end here. And I have 5 minutes, right?
That's fine.
See you in a long time. Typically, as I said before, the confidentiality, it is more about specific technical issues. And for oil and gas companies, what is the most confidentiality is not even the data. It's not that. It is their intellectual property. That's different. They don't share that. How they make the assessment, how they do the calculations, how they interpret things, it's their own technology. The raw data that they acquired, that yes, belong to the government. That yes, they have the right to use it for a time. But the point here about transparency, which for me is ridiculous, is countries that don't even show the contract they signed. Like where we live today, the people don't even publish what they signed. Who do that? I immediately ask, and that's the problem, Guyana. Immediately say, no, we're not going to publish. World Bank say, publish or don't give you the money. They publish, what happened after? Wow. People writing, are you joking? Who signed this kind of deal? Why are you doing that? Of course, there is two sided stories. One is that people don't acknowledge risk. So I understand that Guyana has to give a bit more to entice investor to certain risk. But other things, they haven't done the right way, So that's why you need to be fair between the risk, rewards, and the things. Ultimately, if you don't share what you're doing, it's very questionable what you're doing at least. And the tendency today is every time more open source, And even the region government has done something that I'm not aware of any country doing it. They took all the data geologically and it's open. You need to do what you guys are doing there to knock doors. They did it for you. Just put there, here you go. This is the link. Get all the data we have there. That's the ultimate level of transparency. But we still need some time to get there. And the final thing here, as I was pointing out, is that there are similarities, yes. So number one, your offshore environment that not many other industries are doing. So let's start. Secondly, you need seismic and drilling, to a certain extent it is. Third of all, it is a natural resources, but it's not the same. It's not the same. The risks are not the same. I'm not an expert, but it's better to listen a little bit more about that. The distance, a lot of oil and gas is quite deep, but offshore, and most here is not that deep, not that far as well, And ultimately, I see some room for actually collaboration because a lot of the wells you're drilling, you might have water there or might have access to this to reach to someone else. So it might make sense. And ultimately, from a regulatory transaction contract, I think a starting point, knowing gas, sounds, from my understanding, very logical, but doesn't mean copy paste. It means you need to really think what could work, what could not work, what adaptations you need, So I think I'm adapting on time just to say that it's good to have this learning experience, and I think the colleague we just left here is good to mention from a business perspective as well. Because are you doing this from a research point or are you doing this from a business? In the business, what is the business? Because ultimately, if there is a business, you can implement this in a large scale faster. If it's more scientific, you can still do, but to a smaller scale, much more for open room for other things in the nearby future. Thank you very much.